Chapter 11 of The Adventures of a Nature Guide by Enos Mills. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Every child should have mud pies, grasshoppers, water bugs, tadpoles, frogs, mud turtles, elderberries, wild strawberries, acorns, chestnuts, trees to climb, brooks to wade in, water lilies, woodchucks, bats, bees, butterflies, various animals to pet, hayfields, pine cones, rocks to roll, sand, snakes, huckleberries, and hornets, and any child who has been deprived of these has been deprived of the best part of his education. Luther Burbank. We read and studied out of doors, preferring the sunlit woods to the house. All my early lessons have in them the breath of the woods, the fine resinous odor of pine needles blended with the perfume of wild grapes. Seated in the gracious shade of a wild tulip tree, I learned to think that everything has a lesson and a suggestion. Indeed, everything that could hum or buzz or sing or bloom had a part in my education. Noisy throated frogs, katydids, and crickets held in my hand until, forgetting their embarrassment, they thrilled their reedy note. Little downy chickens and wildflowers, the dogwood blossoms, meadow violets, and the budding fruit trees. I felt the bursting cotton bolls and fingered their soft fiber and fuzzy seeds. I felt the low soughing of the wind through the cornstalks, the silky rustling of the long leaves, and the indignant snort of my pony as we caught him in the pasture and put the bit in his mouth. Ah me, how well I remember the spicy, clovery smell of his breath. Helen Keller. Chapter 11 Children of My Trail School. One summer day nearly 20 years ago, a number of boys and girls appeared at my Rocky Mountain cabin. They wanted me to go with them to the old beaver colony. A boy and a girl started making the request, but before they could finish, every child was asking me to go. "It is more than 2 miles," I told them, "and we must walk." This but added to their desire to go at once. Stepping softly and without saying a word, we slipped through the woods and peeped from behind the last trees into a grassy opening by the beaver pond, hoping for a glimpse of a coyote or a deer. Then we examined the stumps of aspens recently cut by the beavers. We walked across the dam. We made a little raft of logs and went out to the island house in the pond. Then we built tiny beaver houses and also dugouts in the bank. We played we were beavers. On the way home we turned aside from the trail to investigate a delightful bit of forested wilderness between 2 brooks. We were explorers in a new country. The grove was dense and full of underbrush. It was voted to send out a likely boy and girl to discover how many miles it was through the forest. While waiting, we decided to examine one of the brooks, which someone called the Amazon River. We found a delta, which one boy insisted was the delta at the mouth of the Mississippi. No one objected, and we had discussions concerning deltas, large and small. But the vast wilderness between our 2 brooks, which contained really but 1 acre, was reported by our 2 scouts as altogether too large for us ever to explore. Someone then proposed we should cross the brook on a fallen log to see who the strange people were in the wilderness on the other side. The last boy of the party made a long jump from the end of the log and declared he had jumped across a nation, that one boundary line was the end of the log and the other was where he alighted. Just where the remaining 2 lines should be provoked a profound discussion, as boundary lines of nations often do. It was finally agreed that the other lines should be determined by one of the girls taking a hop, skip, and jump. We decided to take a census. and at once everyone began to count the inhabitants of this nation. We found a number of bugs, spiders, and beetles, then other beetles and a few grasshoppers, and finally everyone surrounded a swarming ant hill, trying to determine how to make an accurate count of this warlike and numerous tribe. This was never settled, for suddenly a big grasshopper with black and yellow wings entered the nation from the outside. He alighted for only a moment and then flew away again. The opinion was about equally divided as whether he should be counted as one of the inhabitants or an invader. At this stage someone broke the news that it was already too late for us to reach home for lunch. So intense had been the interest that we had forgotten even to keep track of mealtime. Two likely boys were sent to forage for rations, with suggestions that they go to the kitchen and procure supplies enough to prevent starvation among the explorers until night, and return by the shortest route. While we were eating merrily around a campfire by the brook, a wasp and a fly engaged in a struggle on the mountainside. The top of the mountain was no higher than the knee of the boy who stood by it. When this life and death struggle ended by the contestants falling over a precipice thousands of feet below, everyone concluded it was time to go home. That evening these excited and enthusiastic boys and girls related the day's experience to anyone who would listen. They had been explorers in a wilderness. They had camped by mighty rivers, had seen wild animals and strange nations. Their imaginations were on fire. This world had become an inexhaustible wonderland. These children were dealing with real things through interest, and their imaginations blazed with more keenness than it was possible for the powers of legends and fairy tales to incite. They had been to school, had studied, had worked, had learned without realizing it. Their reports amounted to enthusiastic recitations of new, big lessons, well learned. Best of all, they were happy and were eager to go on with this schooling, this developing. We have continued these excursions somewhat irregularly through the years to the present time, and handled them with increasing effectiveness. While a guide on Long's Peak, I developed what may be called the poetic interpretation of the facts of nature. Scientific names in a dead language, together with classifications that dulled interest, were ever received as they should have been, with indifference and lack of enthusiasm by those who did not know. Hence I began to state information about most things in the form of its manners and customs, its neighbors, and its biography. Nature's storybook is everywhere and always open, and I wish children might have everywhere what the children have had here in enjoyment, educational foundation, and incentive. What we are doing here may be done elsewhere. John Muir, in writing of his boyhood experiences, says, "The animals about us were a never-ending source of wonder and delight. How utterly happy it made us, nature streaming into us, wooingly teaching her wonderful glowing lessons, so unlike the dismal, grim ashes and cinders so long thrashed into us. Here, without knowing it, we were still in school, every wild lesson a love lesson, not whipped but charmed into us." Interest gives the ability and energy to see accurately, and the incentive to watch for things that may happen around us. Added purpose to every outdoor day. Such happy experiences based on interest truly enrich life. Agassiz says that his chief claim to distinction was that he had taught men to observe. Interest is the master teacher. The Robinson Crusoe School was the name someone early applied to us, but later the name Trail School was taken. This school, the great outdoors, is in session whenever children wander over the trail, free from academic chaperonage. The trail supplies materials and equipment, and Mother Nature is an endless mental stimulus. We are in a high mountain valley in one corner of the Rocky Mountain National Park at an altitude of 9,000 feet. The locality is rich in natural history. Within 3 miles of us there are hundreds of varieties of flowers, dozens of kinds of birds, a number of wild animals, including beavers and bears, forests of pine, fir, spruce, and aspen, steep mountains, lively streams, and a number of kinds of rocks. The Trail School is little more than a name plus results. There is no organization, no staff, no opening, no closing. It has no courses of study, no set times for study, no set tasks, no grade cards. The children follow any interest that appeals, and when it appeals. They are never asked to pursue anything distasteful, in fact any given subject or for any given period. There are no recitations and no examinations. Competition, as ordinarily known, does not exist. There are no prizes for excellence, no honors for achievement. Each child is too busy acquiring additional facts to concern himself about having more or less than his companions. He is not studying for a preparatory school or for college. We strive to see to it that these children continually use their faculties, honoring facts rather than authority. Books we highly prize, but their price is made wholly secondary and incidental. Information given the children is tied up with life, connected with neighbors, and given a place or a part in things going on. The following will show our usual ways of answering a question. Walking along the summit of a rocky ridge, we rounded a cliff and came upon an aged and picturesque tree. One child asked what all wanted to know, the name, what kind of tree it was. We speculated concerning the life of this old tree, wondered concerning storms that had struck it. We noticed that its arms were long, so long that the tree was wider than high. We measured its height and its diameter, noted the color and character of its bark. One last year's cone on the ground looked as though varnished. The unripe ones on the tree were grass green. Then we examined the needles. They were fastened on the branches in little bundles of 5. At last we concluded that it must be a limber pine. I remember reading about it in John Muir's The Mountains of California, said one child. He often found it growing on dry, rocky, windswept ridges. When a new boy or girl arrives, he or she is generally full of movie talk or train experience, or eager to find out concerning riding, fishing, or other long treasured plans. But these outing children talk. Presto, change! The new arrival edges toward mother and begs to join the young explorers the next day. We ask the children not to discuss either personalities or the movies. One evening a number of boys were about to leave with sleeping bags to camp for the night in a beaver colony, when a new boy, fresh from the city and the movies, came along. He joined them. He talked incessantly concerning the movies. As soon as sleeping bags were piled and before wood was gathered for a campfire, 2 of the boys led the movie one off behind a clump of fir trees and demanded from him whether he would stop movie talk or if he would make it necessary for them to beat him up. It squelched him. Nevertheless, during this trip he picked up a new interest. We have yet to find a lazy child. Minds and muscles move willingly. Again and again we have been assured that this or that child could not or would not learn, but under trail school environment he formed new habits. Under the zest and spell of interest he joyfully and tellingly applied himself. These children are 100% concentrated. They have the burning morale of interested youth. They are doing things. They want to do still other things. They want to learn. Many of their activities would be classed as work, except by themselves. To help complete a flower exhibition, 2 girls and 2 boys voluntarily climbed nearly 2,500 feet up the mountain. When they had gathered the desired plants, they made a side trip for another rare flower. 2 of these children were considered dull and lazy, yet how energetic and concentrated they were, an excellent illustration of how interest and development create and administer discipline. The mountain trail is a part of the earth's most influential environment. It is an avenue of interest. It mingles life, motive, opportunity, and desire. Whoever travels the trail is enjoying living and learning, is going somewhere. In trail environment, Mother Nature mingles facts and fun, and the traveler readjusts himself to its conditions and develops along the way. With a party of more than 20, we one day cooked our lunch over a campfire. We used little sticks for the fire and kept it as small as possible. As Indians were supposed to be after us, we burned every scrap of refuse and carefully covered the ashes with a flat rock. Being clean is the most concealing camouflage for a camp. When we left it, the place did not look as though anyone had ever camped there. Although we had 20 in this party, we generally limited the number to 5 or 6. Trailing appears to be the supreme outdoor experience. Sometimes we follow the track of a deer or a horse. At other times, one of the party travels for 10 minutes from a given point and is allowed to conceal his trail in every way he can think of. At the word, we set off eagerly to follow this concealed trail. There is concentration, enthusiasm, and application. In following a trail of any kind, the girls frequently excel the boys. One of our excursions was an exciting 2-day search for the source of a stream. We found it above the limits of tree growth in a little pool at the foot of a cliff. There were mountain sheep tracks by it. On the tiny stream, each boy and girl launched a boat, the tiny leaf of an alpine plant, which was to report promptly with its message to some boy or girl in New Orleans. We tried out our noses. Polemonium, with blossoms of peculiar and pungent odor, is called skunkweed. The children were blindfolded and asked to find an interesting flower blooming about 25 feet from them, which was sending wireless signals for the nose. Merry times they had seeking for it. In all succeeding trips that we made there was increased and enjoyable use of the sense of smell. We tasted and smelled of the bark and needles of the balsam fir tree as an important preliminary to searching for it that night with our noses. Anyone who desired was allowed to supplement taste and touch also. A little girl who was the first to find it was not certain until she had touched the tree to which her nose led her. One windy day we were exploring a dense primeval forest when the sound of a cascading brook reached our ears. We stopped to listen and to separate the flowing tones of the water from similar sounds the wind made in the pines. Then we tried to determine the direction to the brook and also the distance by the sounds of the water. In a comparatively open, level place, we walked round and noted the boulders and the trees. One at a time was then blindfolded and asked to find a particular tree or boulder. One of the incidents I sometimes tell to heighten the interest when we are training our senses is of several blind men in Wheeling, West Virginia, who walked more than a mile one winter night to hear me lecture. Another is of a blind Indian in British Columbia who took me several miles up and then down a swift mountain stream, guided by touch, sound, and his imagination. Many a time the children and I drew maps and pictures with sticks in the sand. Sometimes we set down a part of the multiplication table. On a big sand map we located beaver colonies, big trees, little trees, places where we had camped, places where we had seen mountain sheep, places we had explored. One of the places the children best remembered was the top of the Twin Peaks, where we had lain down and with magnifying glasses carefully looked at the tiny dwarf flowers. Another was that strange timberline of dwarfed and twisted trees on the side of Long's Peak. Still another was Chasm Lake, an utterly wild place where there were ice piles, snowdrifts, flowers and lichened rocks, and where a big fat woodchuck had come out to eat scraps of lunch from our fingers. On the sand map we also marked places unexplored, spots where we hoped soon to go and to make discoveries. We try to develop in the child mind the spirit of exploration, so he may enjoy the search for facts both in books and in the outdoors. Before long he eagerly hunts through books or appeals to individuals to satisfy some interest roused on the trail. The results have been immeasurable and inspiring. With eye and ear and nose the children gather rare materials, materials that arouse reflection, imagination, reasoning. The brain is growing. A nature library is kept convenient for the children, and they use it with inspiring enthusiasm. In this library are the best works obtainable on natural history, books concerning birds, bears, beavers, insects, wildflowers, and forests, written by people with an intimate acquaintance with and an enthusiasm for their subjects. These are books filled with facts. There is not a single reference to fairies who rewarded good children. Bears that ate bad children are not even mentioned. There are no billboards carrying morals in capital letters. There are no lessons either brutally blunt or with camouflage decorations. There are no textbooks. Someone once called my attention to the fact that my nature library lacked the common books that were written about nature for children. These had not been intentionally omitted. I had never thought of them, nor through the years had a single child ever asked for one of them. So I believe for most practical purposes they may be classed as non-essentials. One day, while homeward bound after 2 hours with the strange trees at timberline, we purposely came close to a large and nearly round boulder. All ran to examine it. We called it the Ice King's Marble. Ice probably had taken it from the top of Long's Peak and carried it across a canyon. While the interest was on this boulder, the whole glacial story was opened. From that hour these children had an eye for glacial topography and a mind for books concerning glaciers. The children often wrote a delightful account of an experience or of their special interest. Such accounts were not booky, they were spontaneous. These compositions were what we desired, but they were not required, nor even lightly requested. Generally, in the study of zoology or botany, the student begins with the faraway, primitive, and least interesting forms of life, and memorizes. We use the bird, animal, or flower at hand. We learn something of its life history, of its evolution, of its relation to surrounding plants and animals, of its enemies, its travels, its food, and sometimes how it has been changed by environment. We learn something of the year-round life of mountain sheep, of beavers and other animals, and of birds. Their popular names we use as a label or mark of identification, but we learn all we can before becoming serious concerning the name. In due time, and this is by the time scientific names and classifications mean something, the children find both interesting. Our method has been efficient, whether the prescribed one or not. By it, the boys and girls have laid the foundation for an education and learned many of the facts and principles of nature. And what is important, they have learned that the outdoors is friendly. Most people think that the wilderness is a supremely dangerous place for human beings. They carry through life a handicap of fear of the outdoors. These children learn that the wilds are not only friendly, but hospitable. They find ferocious animals only in storybooks, and ere long being out of dark or in the rain is fun. A well-known educator recently emphasized the fact that to have a sane and healthful view of life, it is necessary to have correct fundamental information concerning natural history, and that this knowledge can be acquired only by intimate contact with nature. For 2 or 3 hours in a primeval forest, we played that we were primitive people. The children had a glimpse of the childhood of our race, learned something of the diet of primitive people, why we have so many domesticated plants. All this started overseeing mushrooms and wondering whether they were poisonous. When out with nature, the unexpected often happens. If we come upon something well worth while, like a mother bird leading her young from the nest, beavers at play, or a near view of mountain sheep, we remain and make the most of this opportunity. Each new interest is opportunity. The interest is sometimes heightened by the children abruptly determining what is next to be seen. In the course of a month we use telescope, microscope, botanies, bird and animal books, and frequently call in the use of multiplication and percentage. The children have many irons in the fire. Only one is hot at a time, but how it is then hammered! Anyone who goes with the children is considered by them a welcome outsider or a privileged guest, honored and consulted, but ever under their orders. However, that they should not come to depend on an older person accompanying them, I sometimes leave them as we start homeward. Sometimes they vote to return home under the orders of one of the children as leader, but several often go off together, or by twos, or even one alone. Each child is encouraged to report anything of unusual interest. If a discovery is made, a crippled animal or a rare flower, he is to return at once and tell others about it. Sometimes scouts are sent out to look for young beavers, bear signs, or to see whether the first blue-fringed gentians have bloomed. There is a bulletin board in the nature room on which appear notices of future excursions, of discoveries, of special meetings, of exhibitions, of flowers, rocks, and other things wanted for these exhibitions, and recent outdoor photographs. When the children are not in the field, a conference may be called at any time. It was a stay-at-home day the morning a boy came rushing in to report that a side of a canyon had fallen in. Children hurried right and left to tell others, and in a few minutes all were off to see the landslide. They forgot to take lunch along. Eagerly they discussed the probable cause of this slide and also the results from it. It dammed the gulch and was already forming a pond. How long, we wondered, before water-loving plants and animals would come to live here. This gave an excellent opportunity to discuss the supreme productive resource, soil. Other resources had their innings: water, forests, birds, and so too did erosion, topography, and streams. I had to tell of landslides I had seen, and where the best accounts of big landslides might be read. We were returning from a day's outing when we came upon an unextinguished campfire. "Here is a mighty forest fire," I said. "How many will volunteer to fight it to a finish?" Instantly everyone volunteered. A boy was sent for help. A girl was sent for a pail of water. We fought and won. That night we read up on firefighting. We often walked home through the rain. During several downpours we deliberately went out into the storm. On a few gray days we climbed up the mountainside through a solid sky of clouds until we were above them in the sunshine. We also made little journeys after dark, visiting pine woods, beaver colonies, and streams, calling on hundreds of sleepy flowers, watching shadowy coyotes and owls, and listening to their playful cries and calls. The unfortunate attitude of the parent was an obstacle to every outing. Many were thrown into a panic when a trip for their children was proposed, and too often came out of the panic to condemn such excursions with all the vehemence of old error. Each new parent on the scene exhibited a misunderstanding of the outdoors. We never had a serious accident, never were attacked by bears or any other wild animal, and never did a child even catch cold. These facts, together with the enthusiasm of the children for such outings and their obvious development, won out. We discouraged the collecting of specimens, but we encouraged the bringing in of a mental record, an account of the day's experience. From now on we shall provide a book and encourage each child to write down the most important experience of the day as part of the outing round. I should have done this long ago. I have lost many happy accounts. A few unusual specimens collected by the children have been preserved for their Natural History Association and their Nature Room. In this room they hold meetings. If a child comes upon something deemed rare, something that will be of general interest, he is encouraged to bring it in for the Nature Room. One afternoon the association unanimously decided to bring in a tree with an unusual history. All the children went along, and its getting filled half a day for them full of thought and action. This young pine, when 21 years of age, was knocked down by a fire-killed tree falling upon it. The top straightened up and made a loop almost around the dead tree that rested upon and distorted it. We learned the young pine's age from the annual growth rings in the stump, and also how many years it had lived before being injured and how many since. Occasionally the children give an exhibition and invite the older people to see it. They plan these exhibitions and gather and arrange materials for them. While a rock exhibition was on, we discussed geology, rock formations and transformations, volcanoes, earthquakes, erosion, rock strata and color. During a flower exhibition, we discussed the evolution of plants, pollination, interdependence with insects, and seed distribution. Often I am too busy, or there are too many boys and girls, or it seems best to have someone else accompany a party afield. But to find individuals who will do this without becoming teachy or preachy and deadly to the children is most difficult. Most teachers, some parents, and many others want us to ignore interest and desire and force the children to memorize something which they consider worthwhile. One day a well-known school superintendent offered to help us. He unfolded his plans in the presence of a number of children. I wish you could have seen the effect of his words upon them. When he proposed classes and study, system and grading and examinations, each child heard the suggestions just as he would hear the threat of a probable whipping. The academic mind, and in many respects the old puritanical mind, holds that things pleasurable and interesting are to be shunned, that they are akin to vice, that it is virtuous to do the disagreeable things, and all important to force yourself to do what you do not like. But in human psychology, it is ever important to get results while working under morale, using all the power that interest adds. Thus, finally, you can accomplish the most difficult and greatest results through the supreme, sustained efforts that desire and interest make possible. Natural phenomena interest and stimulate the mind in 1,000 ways. We had a variety of kinds of excellent discipline. I sometimes think that discipline, as it is applied in the school world, actually dwarfs the senses and robs life of its interest. Mathematics, dead language when not liked, drudgery, and disagreeable tasks usually dull those upon whom they are inflicted and develop half-hearted habits. The psychology of youth calls for discipline of a different character. This is pleasurable discipline. These children frequently and cheerfully labor under severe self-imposed discipline, and under this all their faculties are at their best. Fortunate is the child whose discipline is determined by its own inspiration. Interest makes play of the hardest work. We sat for more than 2 hours upon a log by a beaver pond. When we had at last satisfied ourselves that muskrats, the little brothers of the beaver, were living in an abandoned beaver house, we started on, and then questions and comments came thick and fast. Sometimes we would count all the flowers that grew in a circle the diameter of which corresponded to the height of the shortest child in the party. Sometimes we counted all the trees in a given square. Every normal child is as avaricious for information as a miser is for gold. This childish desire to know, to learn, will assure mental development if information be given in a way that appeals. Children can learn but little from cold, unrelated, segregated facts, from academic system and memorized rules. Hence, before the young are assigned to learn the definite cut and dried facts their elders deem essential, they need the development that roused interest gives. We try to use to the utmost the interest of the child. Interest a child, and he thinks. While a child is thinking, he is learning. One interest invariably leads to a larger and then to other interests. Of an evening, I listen willingly to their ideas and comments and to their experiences. I endeavor to make comments that will cause the child to desire to go back and look again at the wonder things he has seen and at others which he apparently missed. I do all I can to stimulate his creative faculty. I ever try to answer his questions in a way that will add to his interest and, if possible, multiply or extend this interest. If a child's lesser questions are answered, he will presently come back with greater ones. Surely the opportunity of one's life is to listen helpfully when the child is talking and to answer happily his eager questions. The experiences these children have and their reflections concerning the things seen give them the ability to reason and develop their observation and imagination. With these powers working, there is nothing that can obstruct a child's way to an education. He wants to learn and will find a way. Sometimes in telling their experiences, the children let themselves go and use their imagination freely. This is excellent. It is a healthy imagination. They simply expand, extend, or create the probable continuation of facts they have seen. There is nothing magical, nothing illogical, no monstrosity, just poetical interpretation of facts. But when asked for the facts about what they have, they give them accurately, the color, size, and the neighboring objects they have really observed. The average person does well to see with 50% efficiency. I have talked separately with 3 or 4 children concerning the same experience, and their accounts agreed. They must have run above 90% in accurate observation. President Charles W. Eliot came out with the following sweeping statement in a recent publication by the United States Bureau of Education called Certain Defects in American Education and the Remedies for Them. It is the men who have learned, probably out of school, to see and hear correctly and to reason cautiously from facts observed, who carry on the great industries of the country and make possible great transportation systems and international commerce. Dr. Eliot goes on to say, quote, "Since the United States went to war with Germany, there has been an extraordinary exhibition of the incapacity of the American people as a whole to judge evidence, to determine facts, and even to discriminate between facts and fancies. This incapacity appears in the public press, in the prophecies of prominent administrative officials, both state and national, in the exhortations of the numerous commissions which are undertaking to guide American business and philanthropy, and in the almost universal acceptance by the people at large, day by day, of statements which have no foundation and of arguments the premises of which are not facts or events, but only hopes or guesses." Again quoting, "In most American schools there has been a lack of systematic training of the senses to record, remember, and describe accurately observations made by his own senses. Little systematic training has been given day by day in the process of determining facts and weighing evidence. Worst of all, most American schools have neglected to enlist and cultivate assiduously the interest of each pupil in his daily work, in spite of the obvious fact that no human being, child, adolescent, or adult, can do his best work unless he is taking an interest in that work." Again quoting, "Remedies are the substitution of teaching by observation and experiment for much of the book work now almost exclusively relied on. The cultivation in the pupils of activity of body and mind during all school time, an activity which finds delight in the exercise of the senses and of the powers of expression in speech and writing, the insistence on the acquisition of personal skill of some sort, the stimulation in every pupil of interest in his work by making the object of it intelligible to him." End quote. The Trail School methods appear to have developed the constant habit of accurate observation, of learning to see, looking with eager, interested eyes, and seeing things as they are. Of an evening, when the children are merrily recounting the experiences of the day, we are impressed with the fact that they see accurately and recount truthfully and judge by the evidence. These children are in love with their activities. Burroughs has said that knowledge acquired without love will not stick. The most amazing things brought out by the Trail School are the accuracy with which the children see and acquire facts, and the correctness with which they describe what they have seen. It might be thought that our ways of doing things would make the children unsystematic, but when reached by that magnificent incentive called interest, the child goes after anything, difficult, easy, pleasant, or otherwise. It is a joy to do it. We found that the children quickly developed the mental habit of being systematic just through interest. It was not long before a child systematically and persistently followed an interest by specializing upon it, thus forming the acquaintance also of the things related to it. A few weeks of this meant 100% health. The child learned to use his senses, learned to see and to hear. He accumulated facts, materials which compelled thought, and developed the imagination. He became a reasoner. The mind grew like a wild garden. When it was all over, most of the children had developed interests in world subjects that had not been even mentioned. They had sympathies, universal feelings. They were developing democratic actions and habits. Above all, we try to develop the imagination, which has been called, quote, the supreme intellectual faculty, an imagination based on realities. This kind of imagination deals ever with cause and effect. It touches cold facts with fancy, gives the poetic interpretation, that is to say, with cause, effect, and vision, it shows possibilities of development. A tree seed touched with imagination becomes a forest full of wilderness life in a natural manner, without enchantment or magic. A prospector dreams of gold and glory. He seeks it with a pick. Never does he look for it at the foot of a rainbow, or expect it as a reward from a king, or wait for a fairy to bring it. Most legends and fairy stories mislead the mind and betray the imagination. Such magic ever dreams of castles in Spain. Mental mirages waste many a life. The normal imagination hitches its wagon to a star or a mule, and the team travels merrily, whether it arrives or not. This imagination is based on realities. It is one that sees the logical and natural results or developments in advance, and pictures glorious changes through natural growth or evolution, and never by magic or enchantment. This normal imagination is a combination of information and inspiration. It is creative, rouses effort, and gets results. In brief, then, all we are trying to do may be stated as follows. We found that every child wanted to learn. He asked questions. Our opportunity lay in the rightful answering of questions. These answers must appeal to the imagination. We tried in our answer to continue and multiply this interest by showing him something new and more than he was expecting. Often our answer was part of a story, but we answered with words, stories, demonstrations, excursions, and even books. He was led into larger interests. Nature interested him most. Nothing discouraged him so long as he was interested. Interest made play out of work. We have never found a lazy child. These answers gave impressions, gave a variety of mental experiences and resources. They pleasantly compelled reasoning and creating, started the unquenchable imagination. In a short time a child was telling of his interests, talking about his experiences. He was learning. He had begun to create and to express. He was interested in life. Dr. Arnold said that if he could teach his boys but one thing, quotes, that would be poetry, end quote. Poetry, of course, sustains and develops that strange but almost all masterly faculty called imagination, and it is doubtful that any influence so helps the imagination as the influence of nature upon the child's mind. When Captain Scott was dying in the Antarctic ice fields, he wrote to Mrs. Scott, quote, "Make our boy interested in natural history if you can." Agassiz has said that a year or two of natural history would give the best kind of training for any other sort of mental work. Long ago Tyndall emphasized the fact that first-hand facts and materials are infinitely more valuable than those brought to us. Burbank has repeatedly said that intimate contact with nature is necessary for children. A trail school may be had anywhere. In any nook where nature reigns, she tells her story to all children brought to her, and they hear her enthusiastically. But a leader or teacher for each school is the rub. Nature will appeal to children and actively interest them, unless blocked by the teacher. A witty woman once said that the way to interest children in good books is simply to expose children to them. A chief means of interesting children in nature is to expose them, to bring them into contact with outdoor things. Every child has an inherent interest in the outdoors, which, with a little tact, may be tied up with any other interest desired, books, a specialty, or with any and every phase of life. End of chapter 11.